We will have the conversations that few are prepared to have, and more importantly, conversations centered on rationality. Subscribe now to listen to Rational Voices with Sunil. Aman, it's amazing to have you on. We've been friends for quite some time. How are you?
Yes, carrying on, Sunil. Good to see you. Good to be on your podcast. And yes, a long time indeed since knocking on doors for goodness knows how many elections we go back.
How how did you get all into the politics side? Maybe we can learn a bit more about your upbringing first, and then we can learn a bit about your political journey. But so born in India, then what happened after that?
Yes, so born in India, I came to the UK at the age of 8, speaking 2 words of English on day one of school. I made Britain my home, and Britain made me one of her own. But that's not where the actual story starts. For my family, Britain has been home in one way or another since 1959, when my grandfather first came to England from Uganda, from East Africa. Now, this was, of course, a decade before what happened under Idi Amin and Uganda and the exodus of British Indians. But my grandfather, he was a carpenter, and he helped rebuild war-torn London post-World War II. So we have had deep roots in the UK for a long time, but I was born in India, in a place called Jalandhar in northwest India, in the great state of Punjab, land of the five rivers. And I came to England all the way back as an 8-year-old, as I said. But I ended up growing up on a southeast London council estate in Bexley, and went on to study at a grammar school, which had an engineering stream, and that really set my tone in life, that this country is the most warm-hearted place to welcome people who have an affinity with Britain and want to make it their home. And you know what, to do it so, to do the right thing in making that happen. But growing up, going to that grammar school was quite formative. It allowed me to really get a decent start in life. But more than that, the really formative type times of that education were when my grandfather would tell me often, look, the best route into prosperity is education. And he would often say to me that the only party that is going to give you the opportunity to have a grammar education is the Conservatives. And I would always ask, well, who are these people, and what does it all mean? And he would tell me, well, it's literally what it says on the tin. Labour will want to keep you as just working labour and not give you any social mobility, whereas the Conservatives, they will give you that grammar education. They will give you that hand up and hand not hand out, and that sort of really got me thinking in my early years in school. And lo and behold, I think I was in year 9 when we had the 97 general election. And that was, as you will remember, a lot of your viewers will remember, was Blair mania. It was New Labour everywhere. And my school had a mock election. And, it was so much enthusiasm at that time, misplaced, I might add, but for New Labour, that nobody in the sixth form wanted to be the Conservative candidate in this mock election. And I thought to myself, okay, well, I'll do it. I think I must have come last, but that was, I think 3 months later, I joined the Conservatives while I was still at school, and really got headfirst involved with getting stuck, in the deep end of politics, knocking on doors, delivering those leaflets, standing for election at various levels, because one very simple thing drove me to it, and that was that, look, if I could have social mobility by getting a decent education, so why couldn't all the other kids around me growing up on that council estate have the same opportunity? And ultimately, it was this whole idea that if I had come into the UK, grown up here, this country had given us everything that we had in life, then, well, I should be able to give something back.
Amazing. And so you obviously a grammar school, and that's when it starts the sort of conservative leaning towards it, and then that just
Mm.
carried on through further education, and then you just kept on.
Well, yes. I mean, look, I ended up having a journey where I didn't go to university like many people from, the 90s and under New Labour uh, were encouraged actively. I mean, a lot of people went on to go and get very, uh, unrealistic degrees, shall we say, but I had a very different route into further life, which was that straight from school, I ended up joining, as it was then, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And that's where I went, I applied, I got in. And I think it was a few weeks after 9/11 that I joined the diplomatic service. And I spent my time working through the various tasks I had at hand at the Foreign Office. But that also got me thinking as to, well, how are we running our foreign policy, sitting on the other side of the desk to the people who were elected to do the right thing on our behalf. And that got me further motivated to get further involved in getting, more stuck into the party and trying to work out, well, look, how best we can sort of, forgive that phrase, take back control from that New Labour. But having said that, I always realized that if I wanted to stand for election or get really involved on front line of things, I'd have to be apolitical. And as you've seen, much of the great blob uh, might claim they're apolitical, but ultimately, as we've seen with, so many people who have joined the Labour ranks, former civil servants, they're not. But I did the right thing, and ultimately, I left the Foreign Office because I wanted to go and stand for election. I wanted to get more deeper involved. So I left all that, went and joined the family business. And for this, I must say, I moved overseas, got a lot of business experience under my belt, learned the ropes of how to be a foundry engineer, uh, ran a foundry, was casting ductile iron and steel. And of course, then a few years after that, I moved back to the UK and finally then got properly involved. Uh, really thought, you know what, the only real way to do this is to put the hard yards in, to burn the shoe leather, and worked my way up through, as it was then known, Conservative Future, the youth wing of the Conservative Party, did all that, local association level stuff, stood for council, ran a parliamentary campaign, stood for London Assembly, um, stood for the European Parliament ultimately, and of course, in between all that, got my first parliamentary seat under the belt. That was standing for the Conservative Party in Northern Ireland in 2015 election. But also, crucially, I think we had an opportunity of a generation where I campaigned for Vote Leave, because I've always believed that we are a sovereign nation, we should be independent, and we should be holding our own democratically elected politicians to account. So I had the opportunity to campaign for Vote Leave, knocking on doors for Brexit. But ultimately, I think it's uh, the fact that we have this great free democracy in the UK that has given me that opportunity to rise up from literally nothing, and take an active part in our democratic way of life. And it's, as a conservative, I've done that because I've always believed that, well, look, I challenge anyone to find me a single socialist country that has been a success, and it hasn't. Whereas free market economics, conservative ideas and principles have been the biggest force of good in the history of mankind.
Lots to unpack there. And I think one of the things that's really interesting was how you involved in Vote Leave, because often in sort of the mainstream media and TV, they will never show somebody who is not white who voted Leave or was part of Brexit campaign, and you obviously were part of that. What was that
Mm.
experience like being part of Vote Leave? And do you find that stereotype annoying when there's so many people like yourself who were part of Vote Leave, but they don't ever show that side?
Indeed, I think, look, for far too long, we in Britain have been, told this story that, first of all people who have the same skin color as brown must obviously think alike, because that's how a lot of the left thinks. They think that because we all look alike, we must all think alike, and therefore, we are this apparent homogeneous block to be politically exploited, when that's really not the case. If we break this down, let's break this down into three things, Sunil. When I was campaigning on the ground, and even the results on referendum night came through, we saw particularly, places with high numbers of Indian origin populations, be it West London, be it places in Essex, be it places in Kent, be it parts of West London. They voted majority Leave. And I think when a lot of us tried to understand as to what motivation people might have had from Indian origin backgrounds to vote Leave, I think it was about bringing fairness into our immigration system. Let's be honest, we had freedom of movement for predominantly white European people with the racket that is the EU, but it was a very different matter if you wanted to come to the UK for the right reasons, with an affinity, and wanted to contribute, but you were not an EU citizen. And I think that was one thing. The second thing was, I think a lot of people of Indian origin are far more clued up when it comes to matter of national sovereignty, freedom, democracy. I think it's somewhere back in the psyche of a lot of people of Indian origin. And funnily enough, I made this pitch when I was campaigning for Vote Leave, that look, being born in India, growing up in India until the age of 8, something that was instilled in me day in, day out of school and the rest of social life was that, you identified as with your nation first. Growing up in India, that was being Indian first. And this whole idea that, the nation state matters, the nation matters, ultimately that's our national identity. I think that really somewhere played a part in so many people of Indian origin who voted Leave, because they have made this country their home, and they've made it because they believe in this country. And thirdly, I think a lot of it was lazy, low expectations of soft bigotry from a lot of people on the left, thinking that, uh, because we can tell, mind my words, these people to vote in a particular way, because we can go and speak to their supposed self-appointed community leaders, and therefore we'll get their vote. But that's not how real life, real democracy works. I'll give you an example. Just a few years, well, 3 years before the referendum, I was standing for the London Assembly when Boris Johnson was getting re-elected. And I was on the London-wide list. I was attached with one of the constituencies in southeast London, and I was getting out the vote. And a BBC World Service journalist came to interview me on the doorstep, following the campaign, all the usual stuff. And he says to me, "So, Mr. Bogle, as an ethnic minority candidate, how do you relate with people in this predominantly white part of London?" I said, "First of all, what do you mean as an ethnic minority candidate? I'm a Conservative candidate standing for the London Assembly, and I'm campaigning to get Boris re-elected, and these are, our 10 big priorities." He said, "Yeah, that's all well and wonderful, but as someone who's not of the same ethnicity as a lot of your voters here in Orpington, how do you relate to them?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you're British Indian. You're from Indian origin. They're not." And I said, "Well, let me break this down to you. I'm campaigning here as a Conservative, not as because what my skin color is, what I look like, what other languages I might be able to speak, and I still wouldn't get it, because identity politics, it's seeped into everywhere in public life in the UK." And that was a very glaring example of that. Ultimately, I had to tell him, I said, "Okay, let me break this down into your own thinking, into your own way of thinking, and let's have a look at it this way. Say if I was a right-wing Conservative candidate over in India, Would I be asking people to vote for me because I looked like them, because they all look like me? Would I be asking them to vote for me because I spoke like them, because most of them would speak like me? No, I'd be asking them to vote for me because I was a Conservative candidate. And I think that finally got through to him a little bit. But this is what we are facing in the UK. Woke politics has infested every nook and cranny of academia, of media, of the establishment. And I think I get very fed up, Sunil, and I'm sure you do too. We've often had a chat on this, of how when most British Indians very proudly identify as British, very proudly are British, very proudly take part in all aspects of British life, and yet there, a lot of the establishment, a lot of the mainstream media always ends up putting, forgive me for saying us, into this sort of pigeonhole box of, okay, well, you look like this and you speak these many additional languages and you have this ethnic background, therefore you are somebody special and to be treated in a particular way. No, we just want to be treated as our white and black neighbors, because after all we are British.
I think that the left in general is so obsessed with race, and it seems to have got worse over the years. And I don't
Mm.
still don't think they've understood, despite so many now. You've spoken up about conservatism for a very very long time, and one of the probably first few publicly with ethnic minorities. Typically, ethnic minorities are a bit more shy in terms of conservative views, but now there's so many, and they still don't seem to understand this. So this was 2015. Do you agree? You think it's got worse since then in terms of this push on identity politics?
Very much so. And I think a turning point was the awakening of freedom and democracy in the UK with the referendum. The numbers of people that came out and voted in that referendum that had never voted for anything else in the previous 20, 30 years was incredible. I think that's what ultimately won the referendum for the vote leave side. But that also has meant that we've had this obsessive woke lefties, these sort of people who have had, for a better way of saying, had completely surrendered any thought of democratic accountability, the very notion of democracy, the very notion of nationhood that included all different types of people that identified as British and wanted the British state, the British government, the British democracy to be accountable to them. I mean, the number of times that we've had the argument made by people who campaign for Remain, people on the left saying that, well, just look at what the conversations we're having on the ECHR. The number of times I've had to say, look, we don't need a foreign court to tell us how to control and run our borders and how to police our streets and who to let in and who not to let in. And the number of times a lot of these people will say, well, we will lose human rights. Who will defend our human rights? And the number of times I have to remind these people that Britain is a civilizational nation, that, you know what, this is a country that gave the world the Magna Carta. We know how to deal with human rights. We are, the synonym for Britain and the Union flag is freedom. Who can forget the scenes in Hong Kong a few years ago? It wasn't any other flag. It was the Union flag that was being waved around because that's the synonym for freedom. So I think a lot of it boils down to this surrender of responsibility in our institutions, that we need to be told by foreign powers sitting in Brussels what to do, how to do it, and also to take the very sort of low and easy way out of taking responsibility for integrating people who are from ethnic origins, from foreign origins, and also to separate people into these silos that so they can throw ever more amounts of money at peddling division. Look at how much we're spending on translation services across the NHS, across the police, across job centres even. It's mind-boggling. Look at how divisive the whole immigration debate has become, not because we have immigrants, although the numbers are astronomically unacceptable, but because of the fact that we were told we're going to get the best and the brightest. And what has the Home Office delivered for the UK? The lowest skilled, the lowest paid jobs are being taken by the lowest skilled immigrants. And that's had a really nasty impact on all the good quality immigration that we've had over the previous 30 years, I would argue. When we had immigration in the numbers of the tens of thousands, when you could integrate tens of thousands of people, relatively easier to do so than integrating or not for the fact of a million migrants a year. So I think it's a long time overdue that we need a real sort of um, hard look at what's gone wrong with both, the deep state of the academia, the establishment, the Home Office. It all needs to go. There has to be a fresh start.
With the immigration, it's really interesting because you came when you were 8 years old, and my parents came in the 70s and 80s, and I feel like immigrants who came during that period between 60s and maybe 90s, I think it's completely different to the profile coming now. Numbers were a lot less, and exactly like you said, they were able to integrate a lot easier. And I don't know, it would be interesting to get your take on this, but it just seems now the people who are coming into the UK don't feel the
Mm,
same way as you may have felt, or my parents feel, or other people feel, which is this is an incredible opportunity to come to the UK, freedom. We got a job to
mm,
do here. We want to make the most of this country, really embed ourselves in the culture, all these sort of
mm.
stuff. It just doesn't seem like the a lot of the numbers that are coming in right now have those same values.
Exactly, Sunil. And look, let me take you back a few years when I first came. In my primary school here in Bexley, I was the only child in that school who needed assistance in the first 3 months with, getting better with spoken English. There were a handful of people, fellow pupils of Indian origin, a couple of people who were Polish origins, a couple of people who were of African origin, but the vast majority of school was white working class. And because I was the only child in that whole year group who needed assistance with spoken English, the school could easily afford to hire a tutor, I don't know, 2 hours a week to come and help me after school with that. And but having said that, when I first landed in England, the first thing that my grandfather thrust in my hands was, an idiot's guide to spoken English. And he said to me on day one, said, "Look, I know you can read and write properly, but just remember these two words, and they'll get you by until you get the hang of things." And he said, "If you don't understand anything, just say pardon, and for everything else, just keep saying thank you, and you'll get by for the first 3 weeks." Uh, but that sort of tells us the story, doesn't it, Sunil? That a as a family, we felt the responsibility that my family wanted me to learn to speak and understand English properly, so that I could get along with not just with my friends I'd make in school, but also understand the teachers that were there to teach me, uh, and also the fact that because the numbers were so low, the school could actually do something to help me. And number two, if you fast forward it to today, the sheer numbers are, well, what do we get with such sheer numbers? We get schools like that school in Eastleigh ending up cancelling Easter in this Christian nation that is the United Kingdom, in return for celebrating so-called Refugee Week in June instead. And I think that's the stark difference that spells it out very clearly of how things have gone downhill in terms of integration, in terms of the sheer numbers. But also, I think what really matters is that a lot of people who came, as you said, between the 60s and 90s, came to this country not just to make it their home, but also to be nationals, not to be residents, simply here to send back money to the place they actually call home. And that's the story of today. When I look around, a lot of jobs that are going around, certainly here in London, a lot of these Amazon warehousing jobs, the delivery riders, all these jobs, they're going to people on low skilled, very low wages, undercutting a British person who could be doing that job, mind you, at the same time. But also, there is no drive, I see, amongst a lot of these people to learn English, to integrate. You see in a lot of towns where you've had smaller populations of ethnic minorities, they've suddenly ballooned over the last 4 years. Certainly here in Bexley, we used to have around a 10,000 odd population of people of Indian origin. And all of a sudden, it's ballooned, I think probably around 10 times that. And simply by the fact that most of these people have come in via the student visa route. And we've all seen the numbers. It's not just people coming in as student visas, on student visas, but also the number of dependents that are coming in with them. Now, you'd think that if you're bringing in dependents, you want to make this country your home and you have certain affinity, but that's simply not the case. The number of people I've had to intervene for who can't speak a word of English, yet their children are going to local schools. As a governor at a couple of local schools, a number of times I've had to intervene and literally, for the welfare of the child, speak on behalf of the parents and say, well, look, what on earth is going on here? You can't speak English. You don't want to learn English. How on earth do you expect to deal with the teachers that teach your kids, the doctors that treat you at local NHS surgeries, and the police who help police and keep your local area safe, and your neighbors for that matter? So that's a real issue that we're facing, and it's filtering through. No matter what any lefty academic might tell you from the wide variety of universities that are infested with them, people are feeling it in their neighborhoods, on their doorsteps. When we see what is happening in our towns and cities, the sort of every night we see, be it across London, what was happening all the way over, was it in Nottingham or Norwich recently with the Eritrean independence protests? It's not in Britain's national interest.
Do you think that's the big change that a lot of people in this country now, they're not in the national interest? And you could look at, like, for example, a lot of the stuff, the protests that we see on a weekly basis, it feels like it's just foreign, and we've imported a lot of foreign nationalism as opposed to British nationalism, which is complete two different things. It just seems more and more divisive and a lot less interest in Britain itself.
Indeed. And as I said, these people are not here to be nationals. They're here to be residents. And
Mm,
they're here to be takers, not givers. It's as simple as that. We now have 1 million migrants, which are not net contributors to the economy. They are taking £7.5 billion in social welfare, be it universal credit and other services. Look at London's social housing scene. Nearly half of it is occupied by at least one person born overseas, a foreign national. And that sort of tells us a story as to, well, if you're here to be simply as a resident and not a national, then you're obviously going to be campaigning for things that really matter to you. Um, and that's sort of filtered through with the rise in sectarianism on our streets, with the people that get elected to our parliament, with identity politics that a lot of our MPs then end up playing in their constituencies. I mean, who can forget that infamous leaflet put through doors in one of the northern seats a few years ago, saying if you vote Conservative, then you're voting for an MP who's on the side of India or the side of Prime Minister Modi. And we had another this time a Conservative MP telling people on the doorstep, well, if you vote for your Labour candidate who happens to be of Indian origin, then who will stand up in Parliament and speak for you on Kashmir? No, you are there as a British member of Parliament to
mm.
address and raise the concerns of local people, which is in Britain's national interest, their national interest. And yet our parliament is jam-packed with people who are far more concerned about what might be happening in Gaza or Kashmir, or dare I say even Ukraine, than on our own doorsteps. Ultimately, there should only be one priority for any British MP or leader, and that is the British people. A roof for every head, a food on every table, and a job for every hand. It's as simple as that. But what we ended up with is sectarianism really taking root in our politics. Look at the number of independents who got into Parliament simply with a single ticket campaign on Gaza. If that doesn't tell you how much division there is, driven by those people who are not interested in being British, who have the sole interests of only foreign conflicts thousands of miles away, this is a real question that needs to be asked of a lot of these people. If you're here to make Britain your home, why are you more concerned about things happening 5,000 miles away? Where's your concern about the state of security for the average man and woman on British streets? It isn't there. And even if it was, then let's break it down. We see these very specific, Saturday protests for Gaza. Where are the similar protests for the endless amount of sectarian violence that goes on in the rest of the Middle East and Africa? We had the massacre of those Christians in the DRC a few weeks ago, let alone protests. Most of the mainstream media didn't even want to report about it. So it tells a story of modern Britain today, that if you had those manageable numbers in the tens of thousands, people could be integrated. And when getting to Britain was not just a privilege, but also done mostly by those people who had an affinity with the UK, number one. Number two, came in with some sort of plan of action. Maybe they had some family links there. Maybe they had a job offer. Maybe they wanted to make a life which they could meaningfully over here. And yet, today, the number of people we are seeing, if you're coming to the UK as a student on a student visa, does it really make sense that you would want to bring your dependents here with you if you were really coming here to be a student? Who are these people kidding? So we've seen a lot of this type of migration, purely economic migration. I think we've seen it in the Middle East. We've seen it in parts of Africa. But then again, a lot of these places in the Middle East are very different to Britain. They are not civilizational nations, number one. They have tiny populations of their own, and they need these people to come in and grow their economies. But we've got 9.1 million people here in Britain who are not economically active. We don't need to be importing, cheap, low-skilled foreign labor undercutting our own people. So it really begs a question as to what our policymakers have been thinking for the last 10 years.
It's fascinating because you talked there about the people who are inactive in the UK, and it's a massive problem about how many adults who are just not even seeking jobs. And I feel like in the last, even previous government, this government, they often flash out the unemployment rate, but the unemployment rate only attributes people who actually are trying to get a job. It doesn't attribute the people who are not even looking for jobs, which millions in the UK are, which is, I think, really concerning. When did you see a real change with the migration, where you saw the difference in the immigrants coming to UK? When do you think it really started? Probably for my
Yeah,
generation, we've probably seen it from the start. We don't really remember a time when it wasn't quite like this. It's probably got worse in the last few years. But when did you first see this kind of change?
I saw it, I think, growing up, probably the early 2000s, and going back into the early 2000s to Neil. I remember vaguely now, and I've done some further research on it to find out exactly what went on in that time period under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. We had this thing called the holiday making work permit visa that was brought in by the Labour government in, I think, the early to mid 2000s. And that basically, what that did was it gave people a 2-year visitor visa technically, but with the legal ability to work, I think, 20 hours a week and be here for 2 years without an actual work permit. And I think that was the first part of the floodgate being opened, because that meant that anyone could come to the UK, and a lot of people did come to the UK, and you could extend that holiday making work permit for 2 years every time it ran out, much like further leave to remain. And that sort of meant, well, previously, the vast majority of people that were coming into the UK from overseas were either, through marriage or through, in terms of actually getting a work permit to come to the UK. And this opened it up for low-skilled, low-paid, and pretty much very unregulated in that sense to just flood in. And of course, What we've seen since is this whole floodgate being opened ever since tuition fees came in. Um, our national academic structure has been so gutted and so rooted out with any real investment or long-term sustainable funding for it, that most universities rely solely on what they can gather from foreign students. And let's be honest, a typical university maximum they'll be able to charge what 9,250 per year as domestic tuition. The same university of that top tier can get anywhere up till what 80,000 pounds per year per student. So it's become more of a cash cow rather than actually delivering education to our own people. But certainly it's in the present day and time, it's the student visa route that has opened up the floodgates. And of course, let's not forget the illegal dinghywalas that have been arriving at an alarming rate. We've had now what 150,000 plus since 2018 that have come into the UK, broken into Britain. 30,000 since Starmer took over back in July. That's certainly adding to it. And of course, you add up all the overstayers, people who've never gone back, people who will never be deported because they've broken the law and are here criminally. The number of cases we see cases in the papers every day now. Who can forget the chicken nugget man? We've recently had the man who was he's a paedophile, but can't be deported to Pakistan because of his alcoholism and how he might be treated back in Pakistan. Frankly, it's not our problem. A foreign criminal, it's not unreasonable to expect every foreign criminal to be deported back to their country. What happens to them in their backward countries is not our problem. Our problem is dealing with what we have here. Now, having said all that, Sunil, let's also not forget in terms of how many people have simply taken the Home Office for a ride, aided and abetted by very unscrupulous immigration consultants and advisors. People being guaranteed UK citizenship and settlement for a mere £10,000. As long as they get here, it's you're here. We will get you in. That's what we saw that expose on the front page of the Daily Mail a couple of years ago. So Britain's immigration system is not just broken, but it's completely unfit for purpose. And until I think we disband the Home Office, we actually build a border force that's a border force and not a border taxi service, things can't change.
How much change do you think is needed in the Home Office? Do you think it needs to be fully gutted and removed? Because if you look at for the last 20 years, it's been a failing group in terms of I don't think any of one has fulfilled what they it wanted to come out and achieve. And it seems like there is no, regardless of who the Home Office person is, it seems like there's no stopping the number of migrants coming into this country. So do you think the whole thing just needs to be gutted and restarted?
Look, the Home Office is, first of all, way too large and unwieldy as a government department. It is the biggest government department. It has more press officers and paperclip counters than actual people manning the border, for example, number one. Number two, the whole idea of the Immigration and Nationality Directorate, as it was, back in the day, is today the UK Visa and Immigration Service. So it's providing a service rather than actually delivering border control and securing our borders and integrity of our national status. So that all has to go. It has to change, not just by in terms of changing around the people who run the place. No, it has to be a whole complete A to Z, top to bottom, bottom to up. Everything has to go. Only then can we actually have people who will be running this place in the way it's supposed to be run. But again, we haven't seen it happen under successive Conservative governments. We haven't seen it at all, even I think on the horizon with a Labour government. But what does that tell us, Sunil? It tells us that we have a bureaucracy that is holding back the democracy. For 5 successive elections, the Conservative Party went to the people with a manifesto pledge of reducing migration numbers to the tens of thousands. And I remember back in the day when David Cameron was first Prime Minister, I think he really tried to uh, bring through change. But who's going to take on the actual great blob and lance that boil? And that's what needs to happen. So if successive governments haven't been able to get a grip of the Home Office, then I think it's fair to say that Yes Minister was a documentary.
With you know, one of the questions I sort of had towards you is why are you so passionate in terms of about immigration? Now, I think for me, one of the things I've come to kind of realize, I think maybe being a product of immigrants and seeing like what life could have been like it had my parents not coming, I feel very passionate about Britain. I feel it's a duty to, serve. It's a duty to try and help the country. Why do you feel so passionate about it? You've clearly got good, strong opinions on this, and I think most people would agree with you. Where does this stem from?
It's quite simple, Sunil. I look at Britain as not just the giver of everything that I am today, but also the fact that this is a great civilizational nation. I am so proud that I am a part of this great nation that has given the world so much. The fact that this is the country that led the world in not just abolishing slavery, but enforcing the abolition of slavery through its own manpower and money. This is the country that gave the world so many of the modern technical wonders that have allowed so many of so many people around the world to have a better quality of life, to have better medicine, to have better life expectancy, and dare I say, this is the country that has given so many places the whole idea of democracy and the rule of law, and so that's why I think as this country is such a great civilizational nation, and if I've had the privilege to be a part of it, then surely, as is surely the duty of any other British citizen, that we should be doing everything in our power to make sure that we can not just conserve this civilization nation, but also make sure that it stays. And the only way it stays is if we can protect and conserve the very nature of the character that has made this country, Britain, Britain. And that is, of course, this is a topic that a lot of people shy away from. A lot of people will make the economic case. A lot of people will make, the immigration numbers case, but not many people are willing to put up their hand and say, you know what, it's not just that. It's also the social and ethnic characteristics of this great country that has made it what it is. How is it right that if we end up turning the white British population into a minority, how would that be right in any shape or form? Ultimately, this is a country that for the last 1,000 years has been built by the British people. Yes, a lot of ethnic minorities that have come in from overseas have made this country their home, have added to the British tapestry of life, of social fabric, and have integrated and have added great value. But ultimately, this is a white Christian nation, and that's how it should be as a majority. And I don't think there's anything controversial in saying that. And my question to a lot of people who find offense with that, and I say to them, well, would you be comfortable turning India into a Indian minority country? And the moment you say that to them, I think a lot of people generally, right-mindedly, understand that yes, you know what, ethnicities are unique identities, and they should be protected.
I couldn't agree more. Now, I think it's interesting how in the UK we're even allowed to have this sort of discussion. In most countries, you wouldn't even be allowed to engage in this sort of conversation where your ethnic minority groups are essentially, they're persecuted across the world. Like if you're in parts of the world, it's not. We take it almost for granted in terms of how amazing Britain is. What do you think needs to happen next in terms of what you're saying in terms of, especially with migration, you talked about rebooting the home office. Do you think, regardless of whoever the next government is, there just needs to be almost a resetting of getting rid of the deep state, a bit like what Trump's doing in America?
Well, indeed. I mean, we've seen already this take place in two great countries already. We've seen it happening in India since 2014, since Prime Minister Modi came into power after 70 odd years of socialist rule with the Congress. Uh, that's led to a great revival of this civilization nation aspects of India. I think India is trying to reclaim its civilizational heritage, lay a real claim on its civilizational inheritance. And the same we've seen with President Trump, who tried very hard in his first term. And I think that's why, after people saw what Biden and Kamala Harris were doing to America and the very nature of America, the very sort of heart of America, that they were gutting it out with endless mass migration, President Trump got voted back in to do that simple job, to put America first. And that's what we need to be doing here in Britain. You know, we've got a bunch of globalists in charge. And in this country, sadly, for the last, 3 decades, the word nationalist and putting the national interest first has been made into a very dirty word. It's not. Look, nations flow from communities. Communities flow from strong families. And if we don't have all those three, we don't have a nation state. And if we don't have a nation state, what on earth are we going to do? So there needs to be that reboot of so many things that are wrong with the great blob that is the Home Office. The civil service, at large, I think needs a real dose of what real world, living in the real world, dealing with the real world matters. We've seen it both the way the Foreign Office is far more office than it is foreign. We've seen it with the Department of Health, with it couldn't work out how best to deliver actual health care and not just talk about it. But more than that, Sunil, I think we need a real reboot of our democracy. Let's be honest. With the turnout we had at the last general election, the fact that Starmer got into number 10 with less votes, with fewer votes than Corbyn got as Labour leader back in 17 or 19 it was. That's a real indictment of how disenchanted a lot of people are with how democracy and successive governments haven't been able to deliver the things they have promised. And of course, all that boils down to the caliber of people that we're getting engaged in politics, and of course, a lot of them having rings run around them by some very serious people within the civil service. So I think our country needs, of course, it doesn't need a great reset. What it does need is a great reboot.
And what do you think? How do you think that happens? There's obviously
So
we're seeing reform
yeah,
doing well. How does it generally happen, in your opinion?
I think, look, first of all, we need an emergency brake on all immigration. I think that's the first thing that needs to happen. The second thing that needs to happen is a great reform of getting people back into work. Now that the fact that we have 1 in every 5 cars, new cars being sold in Britain today, is to Motability. The fact that our universities are preferring overseas foreign students than straight A students domestically. The fact that we are not training enough doctors, right? How on earth does it make any sense that we have an annual cap of training just 7,500 doctors, and yet then we end up importing more of them for countries who can least afford to be sending their hard-trained doctors overseas? So all these things have happened because successive governments, I would argue, have taken the easy way out of long-term problems. Very short-termist governance, I think we've had. We need to go back to basic good governance. And again, good governance, I would argue, can only come through putting the national interest first. Okay, how is this going to benefit Britain? How is this going to be adding value to the economy? And how is this going to deliver for the last man and woman in the queue, be it wanting to buy their first home, being it wanting to find a good job to do, or be it simply wanting to put food on their table at the end of the week? And if we can have people in government thinking just those 3 things, I think we can have that good governance. But ultimately, it's the question of getting that good government into place. Now, we've had 14 years of Conservative Party in government. Uh, yes, a lot of the times, a lot of good people within the Conservative Party try to deliver seriously good change and good reform. A lot of the time held back by a lot of people within the civil service. Yet, a lot of the time, um, our democracy has meant that we've had people in government who simply have got through, not because they have something serious to offer to the British public, but because they have managed to get through, because it's been at times candidate selection has been a club that has been very difficult for a lot of good people to join. I mean, who'd want to give up a decent well-paying job when they're building a family, they're trying to build a life, to come and face a lot of what goes on in the SW1 bubble? And it's not just a Conservative thing. If you look across the aisle to the Labour side, the amount of control that a lot of the unions have on candidate selection. So it really sort of filters through into the people that we get in government. Just look at the Labour front bench today. My 18-year-old daughter has more real world business experience than the whole front bench put together. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that in a country that has been greatly renowned as a country of shopkeepers, we are the country of world finance. We're the country that is, the world's sixth biggest economy. We're the country that is the eighth largest manufacturer in the world. Yet, where are all these people that are doing all these great things, coming and doing them in government? And that's what it boils down to. So we need a reboot of our free democracy and how it works. We need far more people to get engaged in parties that they back, and get involved in contributing to the country. And I would argue, Sunil, that a lot of disengagement with politics is not just people getting fed up of the usual nonsense that comes out of Westminster, but also because of the social welfare state. If those 9.1 million people that are not actively economically active, if a lot of them think that no matter what happens, the 52.6% will still keep on, the 48% will keep on paying the tax for the 52.6%, then why on earth do I want any change?
It's a really good point, and you've made so many points there in terms of what needs to happen and how it needs to happen. Do you see it happening in the near future?
I have great hope, Sunil. I think, look, I'm a great believer that in a free democracy, you always trust the people. The people always get it right. I'm going, always willing to go on a limb on that, and for a very simple reason. When it matters, I think people come out in their numbers and make the decision that is in the national interest. We saw that with the EU referendum, and we've seen that in elections before. Look at the way the 2019 election in December with Boris panned out. The number of Shia people that came out and voted because they wanted to get Brexit done, because they wanted to break that impasse that Parliament of Remainers had put as a roadblock to Brexit. So I think it's about people getting enthused because they see that they want to rescue the country from the depredations of socialism. So I think trust the people. Ultimately, if you add up the numbers, there are more people in this country who believe that conservative ideas and ideals and vision and policies are ultimately what's going to get Britain out of this mess. But those conservative ideas at the ballot box have to match up with what's delivered within Whitehall. And that's again going to be, I would imagine, the roadblock to rebooting this whole idea of conserving Britain.
We had a former MP on this podcast recently, and he said, which I think was really interesting. He said that they should half the number of MPs that are in politics, but pay them double. He thinks they don't get paid enough. He thinks it attracts not a good enough caliber of people, and he also thinks that it leaves them open to getting these free gifts and almost more open to corruption. So he came up with I think, a reasonably interesting idea of cutting the MPs in half, but then also paying them double, so they're less likely to accept these sort of bribes and these sort of things.
I think that's quite forgive me for saying, I think that's quite a cynical way of looking at things. Yes, we've had an endless amount of MPs who have, been in this for the wrong reasons.
Mm,
But having said that, I think we should be trying to attract, as political parties, people who want to come into this for the right reasons, not because they're going to be earning perhaps double of what they might be presently. Now, yes, having said that, we've had a situation where we've attracted a large number of people who would be unemployable in the private sector, and yet they are running, big budgets if they become ministers, or they're in charge of a constituency with 100,000 people in it. Now, I think again, a very less spoken about issue, again, as I mentioned earlier, Sunil, I think is a candidate selection and also the governance, the internal governance of political parties in the UK. It needs to be more transparent.
yeah.
There needs to be far better structures in place in terms of candidate selection. I've been in enough candidate selection situations to tell you that, you know what, that's where it all goes wrong. Um, you trust the grassroots of any party to be a good reflection of local communities, of the wider society, and they generally will make the right decisions. But if you put in front of them three people who are handpicked and shortlisted not by members of that party, but by people who do not have the national interest at heart, but only in it for themselves, then that's what it delivers. It delivers people who are not in it for the right reasons. Now, again, I think that's one type of reform we need. The second type of reform we need is we need to stop kidding ourselves that there is such a thing as an apolitical civil service, that there is such a thing as an apolitical judicial system. There isn't. And I think that's where we need to go far more with the American way of thinking on this. That, look, you know what? When you get a different administration come in, if and those people that are in charge, as those judges who are sitting on those immigration tribunals, those senior civil servants who are in charge of ultimately making the decisions that they present to cabinet ministers to sign off, they need to be democratically accountable, as well as the MPs that we send to Parliament. Because ultimately, let's be honest, we have a cabinet form of government. Most of the people sitting around the cabinet as cabinet ministers are secretaries of state. They are literally getting decisions made for them by the senior civil service and presented to them as the sort of ultimate solution of the problems that the country faces. They're getting then told, well, minister, this is how we can deliver this, but this is the only way we can deliver this, or this is the only solution we can deliver. And 9 times out of 10, a minister will sign it off, because let's be honest, let's should break down the ministers we've had in the last 20 years. I think it'll be even, close the political observers will be hard pressed to point you to a single minister of consequence. Look at how many housing secretaries we had in the last 20 years. Look at how many education secretaries we had in the last 20 years. And the only one I can still point a finger at who's done something decent was Michael Gove with his free academy stuff. But otherwise, that's a real problem that the country faces. So it's a real mishmash of reforming our democracy, reforming the parties that give us the MPs that we elect, and of course reforming the civil service, who then ends up doing the legwork on trying to deliver the policies that those MPs got elected on. So I think Brexit was about taking back control of democratic accountability. And I think we'll be in a far better place if we can have judges, have senior civil servants who are accountable. Now, obviously not directly elected, but if they are political appointees, then the buck stops with the party of government.
I think that's a really, really good point. I think a lot of these civil servants probably sit there and think, they've got their job they'll be there for a while. The MPs, the people around, these ministers are constantly chopping and changing. We saw in the previous government. So if you're a civil servant, you have so much more power because you can sit there and say, listen, you're a cabinet secretary today. You won't be tomorrow. I'll be in this job tomorrow and afterwards. So
Indeed.
naturally they have that power.
Indeed, I think in the evergreen words of Sir Humphrey Appleby, he said the average age of a retiring civil servant is 65, and the average age of a cabinet minister is 18 months. And ultimately, that's what we face. I mean, let's go back across the pond when President Trump came back in January, right? He brought in people with him who are on board with his mission 110% and who have come in with the right reasons. These are successful people who are in it because they're not in it for the money. They're in it because they believe in what President Trump's vision is. Look at someone like Kashyap Patel, the new director of the FBI, right? He's come in first day, first show, first blockbuster. You know, he's going after the foreign gangs. He's rounding them all up. He's going after the drug peddlers. He's sorting out the fentanyl issue in the U.S. properly. But where was the FBI director doing all that before Kash Patel came in? It's the
Mm.
same FBI officers on the ground who are doing the work that they're supposed to be doing. So I think that's the type of political and democratic accountability that needs to come in into our institutions, because ultimately, otherwise, who are they accountable to?
Agreed. Um, it's been great speaking to you, Aman. You have like a closing ritual on this show, which would be really
Sure.
interesting to get your take on it. What is an unpopular opinion that you have that you think should be popular? So it can be something that we've discussed um, throughout this episode. It could be something completely different. But what's an unpopular opinion that you have that you think should be popular?
Mass deportations, Sunil, and I'm sure it's popular on the doorstep, on the in the average household. It's not so popular in SW1.
Perfect. Short and sweet. Thank you so much for your time, Aman.
Real pleasure, Sunil. Thank you.